Assalamu alaikum. I hope you've had the chance to acclimatize yourself with the course resources and course contents. Today's lecture would actually be about the scientific method. So we've already mentioned that a network performance evaluation has to be done in a scientific manner. But today we motivate the case of the scientific method, that why it is the desirable way to do network performance evaluation. So there are three things I want to talk about today. Firstly, what actually constitutes science? What is the defining characteristics of science? What is the essential core? What makes a study or an analysis scientific? Secondly, we'd be talking about how science should be done ideally. So we talk about the case where ethics is very important. We'd be seeing that science actually depends on the scientists making ethical decisions. So they should be not only disclosing the cases in which their theory works, but also those cases which are not in sync with their theory. As we go on, we'd also be talking about what is non-scientific theories. So how do we differentiate between science and pseudoscience? Because there are many supposed sciences which actually may be dealing with mathematics or even in numbers, but they do not follow the scientific principles, which will, so because of that, we would say that these are not real sciences, these are pseudosciences. So we begin with the first topic, which is what is science? In science, we make hypotheses of how things work. These hypotheses are tentative explanations about how nature works, and this is tentative because we always change the confidence in this hypothesis according to the evidence that we have. So if we see that this hypothesis is making predictions which is consistent with empirical observations, then we increase the confidence in this hypothesis. And if we found a counter example, that would actually be decreasing the confidence in this hypothesis. So science is an incremental process, a cyclic process, in which you keep on making hypotheses and then you do experiments to see the validity of that, of the consequences of that hypothesis. अगर hypothesis की जो prediction है और जो actual data है उसमें अगर match हो, so that means our hypothesis is scientifically valid, and it is scientifically valid until we find a better hypothesis. So now let us talk about some things which are defining characteristics of science. The first thing is that science has to be empirically observable. So any scientific argument which is arguing for, or it is making a certain claim, but it cannot be empirically observed, or it cannot be operationally defined in a sense which can be independently verified by all sorts of people, then we will not call this claim a scientific claim. So an important quote in this context is by Galileo, who is often stated to be the father of the scientific method or the modern scientific method. We'll be seeing in this lecture that there is no single scientific method. जो आजकल dominant scientific method है, which is based on empirical observation, has its roots in the European Renaissance, in which Galileo was perhaps the first one who actually laid a lot of emphasis on observations for justifying claims. So this is what he said. What was observed by us may be observed so well that all the disputes that for so many generations have vexed philosophers are destroyed by visible certainty, and we are liberated from wordy arguments. So let us analyze this quote. So to understand this quote, we have to see how philosophers were working out how nature works before the time of Galileo. So before the time of Galileo, the dominant philosophy was Aristotelian, in which the philosophy of Aristotle, which was devised maybe 1500 years ago, was still dominant. और उसमें बहुत सारे premises ऐसे थे which were in fact later shown to be false, और जो dominant science थी वो axioms से शुरू करती थी और उससे देखती थी कि okay, if we believe these things to be true, what should be the necessary consequences of this? But the bad thing about this kind of reasoning, or solely depending on this kind of reasoning, is कि अगर आपके एक्सियम्स में कोई गलती हो और दे आर नॉट एक्यूरेट इनफ, तो आपकी बाकी रीजनिंग भी इतनी ज़्यादा साउंड नहीं होगी. सो व्हाट गैलीलियो सेड वाज, it's not good enough to just speculate sitting in an armchair and just saying that, my reason tells me that things should work this way without any observational backup of this claim. So what Galileo said was that you actually have to observe things, और सिर्फ observation से भी हम basically inferences draw नहीं कर सकते. You have to actually actively seek the contrary evidence. जो आप कह रहे हैं उसके खिलाफ एक्सपेरिमेंट्स करें, देखें कि क्या कोई एक्सपेरिमेंट है जो आपके क्लेम को फॉल्सिफाई कर सकता है. अगर कोई एक्सपेरिमेंट ऐसा है तो you must actively perform it and then see what your theory predicts and what actually happens. So this is the first cornerstone of science. The second cornerstone of science is that things have to be unambiguous. So if you have a hypothesis which cannot be falsified, इसका मतलब ये है कि आप एक ऐसा क्लेम कर रहे हैं जो हर एम्पिरिकल ऑब्जर्वेशन से सिंक्रोनाइज कर लेगा, उसकी किसी ना किसी तरह आपको एक्सप्लेनेशन दे सकते हैं. So that thing is not scientific. A scientific claim has to be operationally defined in a way which can be observed, and also another important thing is that a scientific experiment must be able to falsify the claim. क्योंकि ओरिजिनल मकसद ही एक्सपेरिमेंट का ये है कि हम देखें कि क्लेम वैलिड क्लेम है कि नहीं है. तो अगर क्लेम को हम रिजेक्ट नहीं कर सकते थ्रू एनी पॉसिबल एक्सपेरिमेंट, then this is not actually the process of science and the experiments would be futile. So we need to understand that science actually improves understanding by replacing older hypotheses with newer hypotheses which actually give better results and better synchronization with observed data. And an important characteristic of a scientific claim should be that it should make bold predictions. Bold predictions का मतलब ये है कि unambiguous, explicit उसके कोई consequences होने चाहिए और उसको हम match करेंगे against what we actually observe. अगर आपके observation उसके साथ match कर रही है तो this gives credence or believability to the claim. But if the two things do not match, then this would actually count as evidence against this theory. Okay, so let me give you an example of a testable scientific hypothesis. So this was actually something that was proposed by Galileo. Before Galileo, it was thought, as proposed by Aristotle, that heavier things if dropped would fall sooner to the ground and lighter bodies would take a longer time. But Galileo reasoned that this is in fact not the case. So this is a scientific hypothesis. Why is this a scientific hypothesis? So let me first state this hypothesis. The hypothesis is that a feather in a bowling ball falls with the same rate since the acceleration of the two objects is the same. Why is this a scientific hypothesis? क्योंकि इससे हम consequences draw कर सकते हैं और फिर हम एक experiment कर सकते हैं जिससे हम देखते हैं कि हमने एक feather को भी drop किया है, एक bowling ball को भी drop किया है, and if we can create an environment where there is no atmospheric pressure, so this experiment may still be a thought experiment. हो सकता है आप इसको physically ना perform कर सकें, लेकिन ये thought experiment भी, if it is not able to falsify the claim, then this is not a real scientific experiment. So let me give you a testable scientific prediction. So Newton's law of gravitation can actually predict the motion of celestial bodies. So with this, because this is a mathematical theory, we can make certain predictions. Let's say as a consequence of the Newton's law, we calculate that Halley's comet would next be seen in Earth's sky in 2061. So this is a testable prediction. हम 2061 में observe कर सकते हैं, and if we actually observe the comet, it would lend further credibility to the law which was proposed by Newton. But if on the other hand, the prediction and the data does not match, we would say that our probabilistic confidence in the theory has somewhat decreased. So let us move forward then and see further foundational concepts of science. The next fundamental concept is that science always uses controlled experiments in whichever case is possible. In other cases, we'll be using controlled observations, and we must take care कि सारे extraneous factors जो हैं, which are not active factors that you want to consider, उनको हमने किसी तरह उनका effect eliminate किया हुआ है. So for example, in science, if you're trying to establish a causal relationship का मतलब ये है कि एक variable अगर हो तो the effect must necessarily follow. So this is the cause then, and this is the effect. जो causal effect होता है उसको हम आमतौर पे independent variable या independent factor कहते हैं, और जो उसका effect है उसको हम dependent variable कहते हैं. So if we want to establish a causal relationship, we must take care कि इन दो factors के अलावा कोई और confounding variable ना हो, कि हो सकता है कि ऐसा हो रहा है कि जब भी हम ये करें तो this thing actually does happen, लेकिन these may be actually consequences of another factor. So in science we have to take care कि जो भी हम conclusions draw कर रहे हैं वो इस तरह से valid हो. Our results should not be affected by extraneous factors such as chance. क्योंकि कई दफ़ा होता है कि something happens due to chance. असल में this thing is not the cause of the other thing, but just because of chance something happened and the other thing happened. सिर्फ एक दो दफ़ा observe करके हम causal relationship इस तरह establish नहीं कर सकते. As an example of this, a simple example which will clarify the idea which is used in controlled experiments is the field of clinical trials. तो आप देखेंगे कि when the validity of the claim that a certain pill is working very well, if we want to check the validity of this claim, what we do is हम इस तरह नहीं कर सकते कि सिर्फ anecdotal evidence पे depend करें कि because my cousin got better when he took this medicine must be very right, or this must really have some effects. So we don't depend on anecdotal evidence when we're doing science. So this has to be done scientifically कि हम फिर experiments perform करें. हम एक group of subjects लें, उनको हम blocks में divide करें, और ये blocks दोनों तकरीबन एक ही तरह के हों, so that अगर subjects में कोई differences हैं वो even out हो जाएं. Subjects के differences should not be a confounding variable. So once we've divided our subjects into different blocks, तो हम randomly ऐसा कर सकते हैं कि किसी को ये दवाई दे दें और किसी को एक placebo दे दें. Where placebo is a medicine which does not really have any effects. For example, sugar pill हम दे देते हैं. Just because the mind thinks that this is a medicine, a person psychologically gets well. So अगर हमने इन दोनों चीज़ों के बीच में differentiate करना है, the real powers of medicine और ये chance के ऊपर जो चीज़ हो रही है, तो उसके लिए we need to do control experiments. और science, जब हम proper science कर रहे हैं तो हमें experiments properly design करने पड़ेंगे. It's not just sufficient to do experiments, but these experiments have to be properly designed. Another defining feature is reproducible evidence. तो जिस तरह for example एक चीज़ एक दफ़ा chance से हो गई और उसके बाद वो repeat नहीं हो रही, so we can hardly claim that this thing actually is the cause of this. तो जब भी हमारा evidence जो भी हम present करें as evidence of a scientific argument, it has to be reproducible. It should not be something which only was revealed to me, because in that sense this would be outside the domain of science. So we must realize कि science हर चीज़ को check नहीं कर सकता. Science, for example, cannot tell you who to marry. At least up till now there is no such theory. It cannot tell you about absolute truths. What we can actually talk in terms of science are those hypotheses जिनकी predictions हम actually match कर सकते हैं empirically with data. So एक चीज़ आप note करेंगे कि independent verification जो है, this is actually the difference between science and superstition. So for example, someone claims that if a black cat crosses your path, that brings you bad luck. But is this claim scientifically validated? कितनी experiments हमने perform किए इस तरह के जो कि properly controlled थे, जिसमें इसका वाकई कोई effect हमने observe किया? None to my knowledge. So superstition and science would be separated by the fact that science can be replicated. Science के results जो हैं independently verifiable हैं. So if something, जो भी मेरे scientific experiments हैं, if someone else repeats them in the same way, then he should have identical results. Another characteristic feature of science is that it uses logical reasoning. So let me give you a little background on logic, because this is not often taught in curriculum. Logic is a remnant from very old times. So in ancient Greece, even before Common Era, their society was amazingly advanced because they were thinking of amazing philosophical questions, and they were talking about how to argue properly. So the disciplines of rhetoric, of argument are actually from those times. और आपने 3 philosophers का नाम सुना होगा which have made fundamental contributions to logic. So the first one was Socrates, the second one was Plato, and the third one was Aristotle. तो इनका relationship भी इसी तरह था. Socrates was the teacher of Plato, and Plato was the teacher of Aristotle. And Aristotle was the first one who actually formalized logic. Logic का मतलब क्या है? Logic is the science of judging valid argument from an invalid argument. Argument actually is a statement in which a certain claim is made. और वो claim depend करता है on certain premises. So logic actually helps us decide कि क्या claim valid है और क्या claim valid नहीं है. And logic, as was defined in the time of the Greek philosophers, was actually deductive in nature. So you must have read about Euclidean geometry in your high school. In Euclidean geometry, you define certain axioms, and then you see if these axioms are true, what are the necessary consequences of that. उससे हम फिर further theorems develop करते हैं. And again, from those theorems, we develop further theorems. And in all of this, we're using the science of logic. So next, we are going to study how deductive reasoning is done, and this was how logic was always done initially. और उसके बाद हम देखेंगे कि science actually uses in addition to deductive reasoning also inductive reasoning, जिसमें you only do not reason from premises जो हमने accept किया हुआ है कि they are somehow true, पर हम evidence से भी reason करते हैं, and this kind of reasoning is known as inductive reasoning. So let us talk about this. Let me give you an example of deductive reasoning. So deductive reasoning is an example. Premises से शुरू करते हैं और हम उससे necessary consequences develop करते हैं. So if a statement is a valid deductive argument, then the conclusion must be true if the premises are true. So let me give you an example of this, a classical example. So premise 1, Socrates is a man. Premise 2, all men are mortal. So a necessary conclusion from these premises is that therefore Socrates is mortal. तो अगर हम argument को observe करें तो हम देखेंगे कि first of all what classifies an argument as a valid argument. तो उसका defining feature ये है कि अगर हम premises को true assume कर लें तो फिर ये necessary है कि conclusion भी true होगा. और अक्सर हम जब logic की बात करते हैं तो it is the form of the argument, not the content of the argument. For example, this argument which I've just shared is a valid argument क्योंकि if Socrates is a man और सारे के सारे men जो हैं वो mortal हैं, तो it must follow logically that Socrates is a mortal. Let me give you another example to actually introduce some subtlety in this. So the second example is Socrates is a table. All tables can fly. Therefore, Socrates can fly. So if I tell you Socrates can fly, you'd probably laugh at me. But if I tell you that this is a valid argument, I bet you'd be surprised. So the reason is that logic mein we actually are focusing on the form of the argument. अगर हम ये assume कर लें कि Socrates एक टेबल है और हम ये भी assume कर लें कि सारे टेबल उड़ सकते हैं, तो it must follow that Socrates can fly. So this is the power of logic. क्योंकि with this we can discover new truths. Imagine a world in which actually tables can fly. तो उस अगर world के बारे में आपने reason करना हो, तो you cannot use your intuition. You have to use logic, which is a systematic way of reasoning. जिसमें अगर हम form देख के कह सकते हैं कि अगर सारे premises ठीक हैं, if the premises are true, the conclusion must follow. So let me summarize this in a very concise statement. हम कहते हैं कि valid arguments are truth preserving. यानी कि अगर एक for example एक vending machine की तरह है, अगर आप इसके अंदर truth डालेंगे तो what you will get outside of it is also going to be a truth. लेकिन if you enter something, for example इसी vending machine की analogy को let me clarify. Vending machine actually takes coin as input. आप अगर coin सही enter करेंगे, you would necessarily get the thing which you asked for. लेकिन let's say if you want to hack a little, आप कोई और let's say nickel coin बना के उसमें डालते हैं, it is not guaranteed. You don't know what will happen. So valid arguments are those in which if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. If the premises are false, the conclusion may be false or it may be right. In certain cases it may be right, but chunke it would not always be right, so we would call this argument an invalid argument. So let me give you examples of invalid arguments. So premise 1, cats are mammals. Premise 2, dogs are mammals. Conclusion, therefore cats are dogs. So you would be able to observe from this that this is clearly fallacious, where fallacious means a false argument. But we say that because we already know that cats are different from dogs. So अगर इस argument से हम content को अलग कर दें, so let us see now at the form of this argument. A is C, B is C, therefore A is B. तो इसको देख के आप you can clearly make out कि even if the premises are true, यानी कि A अगर C है और B भी C है, it does not logically follow that A is B. So I guess you'd be thinking that this is a very simple argument to pick out that this is invalid. Let me give you a variant of this. Premise 1, careless people get into accidents. Premise 2, my cousin got into an accident. Conclusion, therefore my cousin is careless. अगर आप पहली argument से इसको compare करें तो इस किस्म की argument people are making all of the time or they're getting away with it. So we have to understand these fallacies, where fallacies mean incorrect or invalid arguments, so that we can first of all avoid them ourselves and also identify when other people are making such arguments, so we do not get, unnecessarily swayed by such arguments. So we've seen valid arguments and we've seen invalid arguments, but you would have observed कि दोनों argument types जो हैं उसमें content is separated from the form. यानी कि सिर्फ अगर हम form देख लें तो we can actually point out कि ये जो argument है ये valid है कि ये argument valid नहीं है. इसकी वजह ये है कि validity actually does not depend on the content. It actually just depends on the form of the argument. And this is the beauty of logic. कि we can actually reason about imagined worlds. Lekin for, our world, which is, not imaginary, we need another kind of an argument. जिसमें instead of just talking about validity and invalidity, we also need to talk about soundness. Soundness का मतलब ये है कि okay, this is a valid argument, लेकिन premises जो हैं क्या वो असल में real world से match भी करते हैं कि नहीं. So for that we have a new kind of an argument which is known as a sound argument. So let me give you an example of a sound argument. Premise 1, Socrates is a man. Premise 2, all men are mortal. Conclusion, therefore Socrates is mortal. So we've already seen that this is a valid argument. इसके साथ ही साथ अगर हम इनकी premises को evaluate करें तो they are reasonable. I mean, most people would say these are true statements. So if your premises are true and if your argument is valid, we would say that this argument is a sound argument. Let me give you an example of an argument which is not sound. Socrates is a table. All tables can fly. Therefore, Socrates can fly. So this was an example I gave you earlier when we were talking of valid arguments in which the premises does not necessarily have to reflect reality. But when we're talking of sound arguments, the premises have to reflect reality. इस case में चूंकि we know that Socrates is not a table and we know that typically tables do not fly. So we would say the premises of this argument are not correct, and because of that, while this argument is valid, it is not sound. So having talked about these three kinds of arguments, valid, invalid, and sound arguments, obviously you would have unsound arguments as well. इसके अलावा validity और soundness के अलावा अब we need to consider a more basic philosophical question. कि deductive reasoning actually depends on the premises. उसको हम assume करते हैं कि that's true और उससे हम follow up करते हैं. So while it is agreed generally that deductive reasoning is very important, it's needed in science, in understanding, in creating knowledge. Lekin deductive reasoning, is it sufficient? Can we understand the natural world just with deductive reasoning? There's a little problem here. जो as I mentioned, हम अपने axioms जो हम define करते हैं mathematics में, जो हम अपने premises define करते हैं in arguments, how do we know that these are actually true? How do we differentiate a valid argument from a sound argument? Because sound argument is a more strict condition. You also need to have true premises, and in addition you need to have a valid form of the argument. So uske liye people started thinking about this seriously, and approximately the Middle Ages, 1500s and the 1600s. So before then, the dominant mode of thinking was based on logic. उसको हम rationalism भी कहते हैं कि you start with certain premises, और ये सोचा जाता था कि knowledge अगर आपने create करना है, you should only depend on reason. So you don't need to match whatever theory of the world you have with what is actually out there in the real world. So this actually changed when Francis Bacon proposed his new theory. Aristotle का जो model था, उसका नाम है, उसकी किताब जो थी in which he proposed कि how should we be doing rational thinking, उसका नाम किताब का था The Organon. So Aristotle wrote this book in which he talked of deductive reasoning, how to create knowledge, how to think about the natural world. But in the 1600s and in approximately this era, Francis Bacon proposed a new theory in which he said that in addition to deductive reasoning, we also need to have inductive reasoning. Because if we do not take evidence from what we can observe from nature, nature does not have any chance to show us something new. अगर हम सिर्फ deductive reasoning ही करेंगे तो फिर जो हमारी imagined world है, सिर्फ उसी में हम reason करते रहेंगे. And beyond a certain limit, you will not be able to discover natural laws, the kind of laws which describe how nature works, the kind of law Newton's gravitational law is, or Einstein's theory of relativity is. You cannot prove this from simply axioms. So he proposed a theory in which he said that you do rational inductive generalizations. आप experiments perform करें, उससे theory बनाएं, theory के बाद फिर से experiments perform करें, trying to falsify that theory, and if things match between data and your theory, you have more confidence. If they do not match, you look for a better theory. और ये cyclic process चलता रहेगा. And this is how science was born as we know it now. So deductive और inductive reasoning में एक important फ़र्क ये है कि deductive reasoning actually gives us certain knowledge. So this is important in mathematics, in logic, where you have to prove things. Again, in nature and in the study of nature, what we call science these days, the aim is not to prove anything, because it's a very ambitious goal if we say that we want to prove something about nature. We just want to understand how nature works and hypothesize. Okay, maybe this is the theory, I think this is how nature works, and I'll be confirming the consequences of this hypothesis with observed data, and if my theory gives good prediction for lots of data, I would be reasonably certain that I understand how nature works. Inductive reasoning किस तरह काम करती है? So for that I'll give you an example. So observe this series of figures. So you see these three figures and you can immediately observe a pattern here. And if I ask you to think of what the next figure would be like, I'm sure you'd be able to figure out this figure would be following. And this is the kind of thing we have in IQ tests. आप pattern observe करें और उससे आप reason करें from the evidence or the pattern that you observe, and from there you generalize कि मेरे ख्याल से ये जो differences आ रहे हैं वो इस तरह आ रहे हैं, उसकी base पे आप prediction करें. So this, I hope, clarifies what inductive reasoning is. Let me give you more examples of inductive reasoning. So we already know that because we've observed the sun to rise for thousands of years, we're reasonably certain that it will rise tomorrow. इस तरह की knowledge का कोई philosophical base क्या है? इसमें सिर्फ हम observation से generalize कर रहे हैं, और for all we know, the future may not be like the past. So while science is, अगर हम बहुत deeply सोचें, तो various philosophers have talked about the problem of induction. How can you, they've even gone on to say कि induction, you cannot do induction, आप generalize कर ही नहीं सकते. But most scientists and the common understanding is that you can do generalization based on observations, लेकिन this has to be a rational generalization. सिर्फ एक चीज एक दफा observe करके आप hasty generalization नहीं कर सकते जो कि sweeping generalizations हो. एक चीज एक दफा देख ली तो you believe कि this thing would always remain in a lot of different cases. This thing will apply in a lot of different cases. That may not necessarily be true. Let me give you another example. In the older times in Europe, people observed that all swans were white. So they concluded that based on our empirical observation, all swans must be white. So they were reasonably certain कि सारी की सारी swans जो हैं white होती हैं. लेकिन when people actually went to Australia, they discovered that all swans are not white. You have a counter example. So just because you've observed 1 million of white swans, you've not proved that all swans are white. You always have this proverbial black swan which can always come and slay your hypothesis, क्योंकि एक counter example show करता है कि आपकी hypothesis does not predict for all of the cases. So the general idea is, इसको जो हम problem of induction कहते हैं, कि even if you have a lot of observations which are matching your hypothesis, अगर कुछ anomaly आती है तो that is a time for reformulating your hypothesis, या आप दोबारा उसको analyze करें on the basis of the gravity of the situation. So हो सकता है अगर minor error हो तो your theory might still work, but if the anomaly is great, it's time to reformulate your hypothesis. So let me show you the idealized scientific cycle. I've already talked of this. इसमें you need to understand that science is an enterprise in which we do not only depend on deductive reasoning. We need to do inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. और ये बार बार हम करते रहते हैं. So we form initially hypothesis. Hypothesis is just a guess of how nature works. इसको आप guess कह लें, इसको आप conjecture कह लें, इसको आप अपनी explanation कह लें. With this explanation, इस एक्सप्लेनेशन से कुछ नेसेसरी कॉन्सिक्वेंसेज होंगे. वही हम बात जो डिडक्टिव रीजनिंग में कह रहे थे कि इफ समथिंग इज ट्रू, समथिंग मस्ट नेसेसरली फॉलो फ्रॉम दैट. अब इस जो हमारी प्रिडिक्शंस हैं, इसको अगर हम मैच करें अगेंस्ट रियलिटी एंड वी सी हाउ मच सिंक्रोनाइज दे आर, अगर बहुत ज़्यादा मैच है तो ओके, वी हैव डन अ गुड जॉब. बट इफ देयर इज अ सिग्निफिकेंट डिफरेंस, it's time to actually make a new hypothesis. And when you make a new hypothesis, अब वापस शुरू से शुरू करेंगे. Hypothesis आपने नहीं बनाई, calculate the necessary consequences. Again, do experiments, match the observations against hypothesis, and see if there is a good match. If you validated your hypothesis, good enough. Otherwise, it's time to go back and think again. What may be a better explanation of how things work? So, as mentioned, science, you can call it a cyclic process. कभी ऐसा नहीं होगा कि science has actually proven something, because I've already mentioned कि जब हम induction की बात करते हैं तो जिस तरह black swan ने आके all white swans की theory को एक तरह से disprove किया था, एक counter example kills the generalization, क्योंकि generalization का मतलब है कि this must hold for all cases. लेकिन एक काउंटर एग्जाम्पल आ गया तो दैट मीन्स जनरलाइजेशन सही नहीं है, देयर आर एक्सेप्शंस. तो साइंस भी इसी तरह है. यू मेक अ हाइपोथेसिस, यू कैलकुलेट द कॉन्सिक्वेंसेस, यू डू एक्सपेरिमेंट्स, मैच द डेटा एंड योर प्रेडिक्शंस. उसके बाद आप एक नई हाइपोथेसिस बनाते हैं. तो साइंस वर्क्स इन दिस मैनर. सो लेट मी देन समराइज दिस पार्ट ऑफ दिस लेक्चर, जिसमें हमने बात की थी कि व्हाट इज साइंस. So we've mentioned some salient points of science. We've mentioned that science works through the process of hypothesizing. We make tentative explanation of how the world works, and then we compare the predictions of that hypothesis against data. Uske baad, another salient feature is that we do controlled experiments in which we actually try to eliminate all the confounding factors, and we focus on the factors that we're interested. Lastly, the defining feature of science is that it is based on empirical observation. If something cannot be empirically observed independently in a replicable manner, it's not science. Now I want to talk about how science should actually be done. So what are the good practices in doing good science? So we would see that even while you're doing science, you can actually, by violating the principles of science, make your scientific analysis more like a pseudo scientific analysis. So let us see what are the things that we must actually take care of. So the first thing is, it deals with the replicability of your experiments, that whatever experiments that you've done, whatever conclusions that you've drawn, it should be independently verifiable. So for that you should document all of your experiment. जितनी आपकी assumptions हैं उनको आपको explicitly list करना चाहिए, because many times people perform experiments, they do simulations, they do all kinds of modeling to actually do a network performance analysis, but when they're publishing their research, they do so in a way in which many of the assumptions are implicit. So do not assume that the reader or the audience of your or the consumer of your research report or your research presentation would automatically understand whatever steps you've done or whatever assumptions that you're making. So it actually depends on the audience that you have, but always err on the safer side. So include as much data as possible. So you should also be sharing, for example, source code, simulation code, whatever whatever tool you use for doing your experiments, you should be making it as accessible to the general scientific community as possible. The second point deals with the data analysis. क्योंकि आपने एक दफ़ा experiment perform किया, you have certain results. Many times we do tampering with data which we believe to be true. For example, you've done an experiment and you have some data, but some data is inexplicable. So you don't understand कि ये डेटा इस तरह कैसे आ सकता है, तो व्हाट यू डू इज कि आप उस डेटा को फिल्टर कर देते हैं. सो इफ इट डज नॉट confirm your hypothesis, आप उसको शेयर ही नहीं करते. So this actually in the scientific history has done much damage. So if you keep on filtering your data to correspond to the current scientific worldview, तो कई दफ़ा ऐसा होगा कि you're impeding the progress of research. क्योंकि हम देखेंगे कि साइंस असल में पैराडाइम शिफ्ट्स होते हैं उसके. So in all eras you have certain dominant modes of thinking. साइंस में एक dominant mode है कि चीज़ें ऐसी हैं और बाकी theories कोशिश करती हैं कि उससे अपने आप को align करें. But when you have a paradigm shift, things actually turn maybe on its head. You have a better paradigm which describes the natural phenomena in more detail, but this improvement in the current paradigm is actually delayed. अगर हम हमेशा कोशिश करेंगे कि अपने डेटा को इस तरह का बना लें कि करंट जो स्टेटस को है उससे वो मैच करे या जो हमारी इंट्यूशन है उससे मैच करे, तो दिस इज एक्चुअली नॉट गुड एनालिसिस. सो वी मस्ट टेक वेरी गुड केयर कि आउटलायर्स को हम प्रॉपरली मैनेज करें. ऑब्वियसली इट रिक्वायर्स अ लॉट ऑफ जजमेंट. कई दफ़ा ऐसा होगा कि यू एब्सोल्युटली नो दैट दिस डेटा इज़ नॉट पॉसिबल. आपके इक्विपमेंट की गलती है, ये आपकी रिकॉर्डिंग की गलती है. समथिंग इज टोटली इम्पॉसिबल, बट दिस समथिंग इज टोटली इम्पॉसिबल इज एक्चुअली बेस्ड ऑन जजमेंट and thus it is liable to be affected by bias. So we must take care that data analysis is done in an unbiased manner and in an objective manner. Objective manner का मतलब यहाँ ये है कि अगर आपके अलावा कोई और भी ऑब्जेक्टिव साइंटिस्ट उसको देखे तो उससे उसको वही कंक्लूजन्स ड्रॉ करने चाहिए irrespective of the background that you have. Okay, let's see the next point. You should describe all experiments that you've done to actually falsify your hypothesis. This is very important because we've already mentioned that science moves in a way in which experiments are explicitly designed to falsify some dominant theory. It may be your theory, or you may be doing experiments to check the theory of someone else. But whatever work you're proposing, आपको उसकी limitation खुद बतानी चाहिए. आपको बताना चाहिए कि I did this experiment, but it did not correspond very well with this set of configurations. So if you do it yourself, you're doing a good job, a good scientific job. But if you hide certain things from the general public, it is actually going to be, it is going to come out. People are going to try to replicate your experiments. They would know that, you actually hid something, and that may be the end of, people's scientific career. So it's very important कि हम इस चीज़ की पूरी कोशिश करें कि साइंस जब हम कर रहे हों तो वी मस्ट डू इट इन एन एथिकल मैनर. लास्टली एक इम्पॉर्टेंट चीज़ ये है कि आपकी जो भी हाइपोथेसिस है, वट एवर वर्ल्ड व्यू यू हैव, यू मस्ट नॉट बी मैरिड वेरी क्लोजली विद इट. यानी मेंटली यू मस्ट नॉट थिंक कि अब मैंने इस पर इतना काम किया है, मैंने इतना सोचा है, मैंने ये चीज़ अब बना ली है, आई कैन नॉट नाउ गो बैक एंड डू दिस अगेन. सो it's often said, an example is given of Pygmalion, एक play था in which the creator of a model actually fell in love with the model. So we must not do that as scientists, क्योंकि साइंस की इम्प्रूवमेंट ही तब होती है when models are changed. जब आपका एक्सपेरिमेंट आपको कोई ऐसी बात बताए जो आप एक्सपेक्ट नहीं कर रहे थे, तो फिर डिस्कवरी का प्रोसेस होता है. अगर जो आपने सोचा हुआ था everything is corresponding to that, then it's just a measurement. is जो हमने पहले कॉन्टेक्स्ट में बात की थी वाइट स्वैन्स और ब्लैक स्वैन्स, इट्स जस्ट अ वाइट स्वैन एंड देयर आर मल्टीपल्स ऑफ वाइट स्वैन्स आउट देयर. जो ब्लैक स्वैन है वो एक्चुअली इंफॉर्मेशन देती है. सो वी मस्ट नॉट fall in love with our models and we must not filter our data. So let me talk some more about ethics of science. So this course is actually a lot about modeling. और modeling का मतलब क्या है? You try to capture the essence of the system in as simple a way as possible. So essentially all models are approximate. So I'll give you an approximation of what ethics is by giving you two quotes. And I think it captures the essence of what ethics in science is about. So let me give you those quotes. The first quote is by Edward Tufte, who is very famous in data visualization circles. He is also a trained statistician and a scientist. So what he says is very important. He says that as a scientist, we must maintain high standards of quality, relevance, and integrity. He mentions three things. Quality का मतलब ये है कि we should not compromise on the quality of the work we're doing. We should not be focusing on the convenience of our efforts, that okay, this experiment is simple to perform, okay, so we do this, या this metric is simpler to calculate, इस वजह से हम अपने system को इस metric में quantify करेंगे. But we have to see that what is the best thing that we can do in a practical sense. So, and then an important thing is, because Edward Tufte is a proponent and a master of data visualization, that whatever data that we have, उसमें से हम meaningful insights gain करें और उसको अच्छी तरह present करें. The second point he makes is about relevance. This is very important because many times we bring irrelevant supporting evidence. So if I'm claiming something, जो उसका evidence होगा, it must actually be supporting the claim. If it is irrelevant to our claim, it does not give us any more confidence. And the last thing he mentions is integrity. And we'd be seeing this when we talk of data visualization, कि data को आप कई दफ़ा distort कर सकते हैं, statistics ऐसे आप इस्तेमाल कर सकते हैं जो insight convey कर रहे हैं, that's actually not consistent with reality. So many times statistics is used to convey that your system is better, whereas statistics should actually be used to see what is actually contained in the data, what insights can we gain from the data, what are the patterns inside. Agar hum, because many people are not very proficient with numbers, if they're given any number, wo kahenge, okay, this is statistics, and okay, so this must be totally right, but we must be very careful. So this quote then captures the essence of science. All scientific analysis and all scientific experiments should have quality, it should have relevance, and it should have integrity. The second quote I want to tell you is from Richard Feynman, who is a famous physicist, also a Nobel laureate. So he said that scientific ethics, it's a kind of scientific integrity that corresponds to a kind of utter honesty. For example, if you're doing an experiment, you should report everything that you think might make it invalid. This is very important because many times we're only presenting data that makes us look good, that makes our models, sound very impressive. But for good science, and most scientists know this because all models are approximations. No model can be perfectly aligned with what reality is, because if you make your model complex enough, it makes it very unwieldy. उससे फिर काम करना बहुत मुश्किल हो जाता है. The purpose of a model is to be approximate, but to provide you insight. So, but because that model is not going to work for all data, you must report where your model is not working well, and not only where it's working well. So this wraps up this part in which we talked of ethics of science, and we mentioned that it's very important that we do science in an ethical way. So science is not only an intellectual activity, but also a moral activity. So we must take care not to fool ourselves and to fool people, because this is only going to affect the progress of the entire scientific community. So having talked about the importance of science for network performance evaluation, we need to understand the difference between science and those disciplines which are not scientific. So for example, you have the discipline of arts, in which the understanding of facts would be subjective in a sense. So everyone would have his own understanding of how things work. But this is not how science works, because science has to be objective. Regardless of the person making the observation, he should be, if this is a scientific argument, he should come to the same conclusion. Science is also not like political science, for example, because political science, those people working in such a discipline would be having different interpretations of past events. And, based on that, they would have a different worldview. And the richness of political science is in the diversity of opinion. But in science, because it is objective, it differs from political science in this sense. We must understand that science cannot be applied to all things. For example, matters of religion, the matters which we believe would not be subject to science, because the revealed truth, we cannot judge their truthness through scientific questions. So it would be foolhardy to subject religious questions to science. The main audience or the main target of scientific inquiries would be understanding how nature works. For example, the science of physics. It tries to understand how nature works. Or for example, you want to understand the chemical composition of the earth. So you have earth sciences, you have chemistry. And also in network performance evaluation, a science, an essential component of any scientific endeavor would be the dependence of statistics. So statistics helps us make meaning from data. It helps us understand what patterns are there in the data. So, for example, science requires inductive generalizations. So if you observe something, you want to generalize from that observation कि क्या general law है जिसकी एक consequence ये है. So science actually depends a lot on these kinds of inductive generalizations. Science requires both inductive and deductive reasoning. So whenever we're talking of that, we have to take care to generalize in a sense which is commensurate with the evidence that we have. So we use science of statistics in that. So let me then enlist the differences between science and those disciplines which are not scientific. So a very influential concept that has been proposed by a very famous philosopher, Karl Popper, is that, the defining difference between science and non-science is that in non-scientific disciplines, you may have a theory which is not falsifiable. So that means कि आप जो मर्जी चीज observe कर लें, the theory is so general that it will also accommodate that observation. So it can actually explain all kinds of observation. तो हम उस hypothesis को गलत साबित कर ही नहीं सकते. So in this sense, जो science का normal procedure है of hypothesis, calculating consequences, matching against observations, making a new hypothesis, that would be, inapplicable. So Karl Popper, he says that pseudoscience, or those disciplines which may look like science but which are not scientific, are those in which you cannot falsify your theory under any possible experiment. Some more differences. In unscientific discipline, so any unscientific discipline, whatever claim is being made is not independently verifiable. We've seen that in science, whatever conclusions you're drawing, if someone else has the same apparatus, if he has access to whatever method you're using, he should be able to draw the same conclusions. But in pseudosciences, you have claims which are so general that they can fit any observation. And Karl Popper gave an example of astrology. So astrology is something which predicts, makes predictions for a very general class of public. और उसमें जो भी observation हो जाए, जो भी empirically चीज actually occur की है, they can make up some sort of a theory और अपनी hypothesis को उसके हिसाब से वो मिला सकते हैं. Another example, a favorite example of Karl Popper was the theory of Sigmund Freud. उसकी जो psychoanalysis की theory थी, he said that this theory is not scientific because his theory matches with all possible observations. So in that sense, when we actually do NPE, or network performance evaluation, we must take care कि हमारा claim है, it's not dogmatic. Something that is dogmatic is based on belief. तो हम ये नहीं कह सकते कि हमारा system अच्छा है, I don't care whatever evidence you have, because this would not be a scientific method. आप scientific claim करेंगे and then you would be seeing against evidence if evidence is supporting your claim or is going against your claim, and then we decide accordingly. So number one is your results cannot be duplicated in pseudosciences, but in scientific experiments you should be able to duplicate your results. In a scientific experiment, the claim or the hypothesis has to be falsifiable, and you actually must do those experiments yourself actively. जब आप कोई hypothesis propose कर रहे हैं, it's not good enough saying that okay, I think the world works like this, or I think ये system इसकी performance इतनी होगी. In fact, you have to do a systematic analysis. You have to perform experiments. You have to create data and then analyze that data in a way which is consistent with good scientific practice. Only then you can make some conclusions out of your claim. Otherwise, it's just a claim. So scientific claims are more than just a claim. They have supporting evidence. The third point is the dependence on empirical observation. So quote of Richard Feynman is very relevant here when he says that the defining feature of science, or the definition almost, is that everything is to be judged on the results of an experiment. So it does not matter how intelligent you are or how influential you are. If the results of your prediction do not match with observation, your theory is wrong. So let me now conclude this lecture. In this course, we are learning the tools of doing scientific network performance evaluation. और आज के दिन में I try to motivate you that science should be our preferred choice of doing analysis. So let me just recap the things we've studied. The first thing that I want to emphasize again and reiterate is that science provides us a systematic, evidence-based method of doing network performance evaluation. It uses tools of mathematical logic, it uses tools of statistics, tools of design of experiments, and a host of other techniques to give us objective answers which are not affected by bias. Secondly, we've mentioned that scientific network performance evaluation is both an intellectual task and a moral task. So it is important that we do not present data that is not true, that is doctored, that is engineered to give a better performance than your system actually performs. Lastly, one of the benefit of having scientific method is that the scientific theories are self-correcting, whereas dogmatic claims do not change dynamically with increasing evidence of something. Scientific theories, agar wo galat bhi ho, to the future coming scientist can always propose a better theory. So with this, I conclude this lecture. I'll see you next time.